My name is Keith McDaniel, and today is July the 18th of 2023, and I am in Kingston, Tennessee, and I am talking with Dixie Ruth Stegall. And Miss Stegall, thank you for talking to me today.
Keith, I am Dixie Ruth Stegall Mason.
Okay.
And that was my mistake on our documents there.
That's all right.
But I was born in Rockwood, Tennessee
Uh-huh.
on October the 29th, 1938, and Dr. Phillips delivered me.
Okay.
My parents, Richard Hood Stegall and Sarah Ruth Margaret Browder, were married in Rockwood at a Presbyterian church between services 2 years before I was born, 1936.
Okay.
But the day I was born, my dad, with his sister and his brother-in-law, Catherine and John Williams, sat in a car outside the hospital waiting for my birth.
Okay.
When the doctor came to say, or the nurse said, "You have a boy," and then Dr. Phillips came to say, to show him, "You have a girl." My dad said, "Doc, tell me, let me see that baby. I can damn well tell what it is." So that was the closest he ever came to having a boy. He had 4 girls.
Is that right? Now, let me ask you a question. Were your parents from this area
They
originally?
both. My mother was born at Wheat, Tennessee,
Okay.
where all of her family, all of her siblings, her grandfather, father, and all lived.
And she was a Browder.
And she was Sarah Ruth Margaret Browder.
Okay. And,
Yes.
And is that the Browder clan that have been around for so long in
Yes,
Kingston?
her family sold the farm. They were required to relinquish the farm when Oak Ridge came. And her brothers Ed, Joe, and Ray were able to purchase oil trucks and supply and develop, really, not develop, but start Harriman Oil Company.
Oh, okay,
and
yeah.
supply gasoline to Oak Ridge.
Ed Browder. I remember Ed Browder. So.
And he's one of the 9 Browder children who all went to school at Wheat and lived there until they had to leave.
Right.
My mother was the youngest of the 9 children.
So she grew up in Wheat.
She grew up in Wheat. She was the last child born there at home, and all of her siblings attended the Wheat schools, but she and her sister was sent to Lenoir City to live with my grandfather's sister, and then later my mother, when she began school, was sent there, so they wouldn't have to ride the horse to school in the wintertime.
Right.
So,
Let me ask you a question. So was she growing up in Wheat when Wheat was like a big peach town, peach area?
Yeah, my mother would come home in the summer. She lived at Wheat, but when she began school, yes, my grandfather, in fact, I think the family sold some property there for the peach
orchard.
Yeah. Wow. And they moved. My grandparents moved to Kingston when they had to leave while the reservation was being built. They called it the reservation, the project, or the secret city. They moved to Kingston, and my grandfather, they moved to the toll house, which is Highway 58 now. The toll bridge on Highway 58, he was the toll keeper.
Oh, is that right?
And they had a house positioned right there at the edge of the bridge, and there was a window in the house, and the family would take turns taking the toll.
Is that right?
Yes, and my mother worked there,
Uh-huh.
but after while the family lived in that house.
Yeah.
My mother was there, and I think my Uncle George Browder even lived at that time. And
So they have history in this area, and then they met and married and had you. And did you have?
I wanted to tell you that after I was born,
Uh-huh.
well, my dad and mom brought me to the Stegall, his home in Kingston on Spring Street, and while we lived there, well, I wanted to tell you a little bit about my dad. He had attended Roane County schools and had gone to Bryan College, and then returned home when he was needed at home. And about that time, he, I guess he worked for the WPA when he and my mother were married.
Right.
And my granddad encouraged my dad at that time to purchase acreage. It ended up being about 100 acres in South Kingston. He made payments on property that was for unpaid property taxes.
Right.
They still do that today.
Yep.
And he made $10 or $15 a month payments all those years for
And that was
this
a lot.
property.
That was a lot back
And it was a
then.
great sacrifice.
Sure.
And about that time, we lived with my grandmother and granddaddy on Spring Street for just a few months after soon, when I was about 9 months old. They determined they're going to have another baby, and we moved to South Kingston, Highway 72, to a square house on my dad's, the Stegall farm, his grandparents' farm.
All right.
And that's where Annabelle, my sister, was born, when I was 10 and a half months old.
Yeah.
And by that time, Dr. Nat Sugarman had come to Kingston, and he traveled to that house to help my dad deliver Annabelle, my sister Annabelle.
All right.
And I guess I'd like to tell you about
Now,
my dad.
tell me, did you have other siblings?
I do. Later, I was
Okay.
going to tell you
All
later. 10 years later, my sister Peggy B was born.
Okay.
But in between that, the four girls my dad had, the third child, 1943, was stillborn. And so those were the four girls my dad had. And I was delighted when I was 10 years old to have a baby sister.
I bet.
And I guess I wanted to tell you about my dad's 10 siblings.
Okay.
Well, he was one of the 10,
Right.
but it was Anna Murray and Catherine and Jesse, Richard, May, Houston, Bill, Polly, and David. And the youngest two were at home when I was living there, when we lived there when I was a baby, so I became very close to all of his siblings, my aunts and uncles, because our families gathered. The activities growing up were to be with family.
Sure.
And
there wasn't a whole lot else to do, to be quite honest.
Absolutely.
You had to create your own entertainment.
Every Sunday you would gather I would gather at the Stegalls in Kingston or the Browders in Harriman, sometimes on the same day during holidays.
Sure.
But after we lived in the square house on Highway 72, my dad built a small house next to his parents back in Kingston. And
Where was that?
on Spring Street, next to my parents on
Okay.
Spring Street,
Okay.
and right across from the water, we had a community. There was only 500 people in Kingston when I was born, I understand. And we had the neighbors. The postmaster lived just across the street.
Yeah.
The lads, the county doctor, Dr. Fly, and the Crowders. and it's where the community center is now.
Sure.
But it was a beautiful place to grow up. Our neighbors, the Henleys, and the community, that was our community.
Yeah.
And then, I guess about that time, we moved, when we came back to the little house, Annabelle and I attended the Roane County schools, and then in 1948, my dad decided that we needed to go to Oak Ridge
Okay.
to live. So that he wouldn't have to travel as much.
Sure.
And we lived in a flat top, a 2-bedroom flat top.
But let's go back for just a minute. I want you to tell me what was it like. You talked a little bit about what it was like to grow up in Kingston, but as a kid, what was it like living there on Spring Street? What were the things that you did, the places that you went? You know, you were really sort of downtown. I mean, close to downtown. So I guess downtown was within walking distance for you.
We walked everywhere.
Yeah.
We walked to school every day. We as a child, as a young, sometimes it was boring.
Yeah, I'm sure.
But we would go to the library. Mrs. White, Bowden White's mother, was the librarian.
Now, was the library in that little building?
It first was in the courthouse.
Okay.
And so was the county doctor in the historic courthouse now.
Sure, the old courthouse.
And we went swimming in the Rose Bailey Lake. You couldn't go in. We were not allowed to go in the lake.
Right.
Because of the different contaminations then.
Sure. So you went out to Rose Bailey Lake and went swimming out there.
Yes, it was wonderful.
Were there any places in town that you would go, like drugstores?
Well, oh yes, the Kinzer drugstore. Dr. That was the center of town. Plus, there was a grocery store, a movie theater. And
was there a roller rink there then?
Later.
When the roller rink came in.
Yes, by the time I was in high school, there was a roller rink. And in high school, it was wonderful too, though. It was just community.
Yeah.
We were an hour away from Knoxville.
Yeah.
You rode buses, but Dr. The drugstore had a soda fountain and little tables and chairs, and the community would go there to visit. That would be a visiting place.
Sure.
And our doctors, Dr. Sugarman's office, Dr. Ferguson, we had a little nice community.
Sure, exactly.
And I played sports with the neighborhood, Annabelle and I did. We'd play all the sports in the Crowder's yard.
Yeah.
Right there on Church, well, it's Race Street.
Right.
It was a big yard. Now they've widened the roads, and there's not so much space there. We would play sports in season. For each season, we would play that all. We had basketball, football.
Right, sure.
So I had a good time growing up. And my sister Annabelle we would just beg her to play with us. She would like to read and crochet, but she would join us in all the sports.
Did you have any best friends in Kingston?
Oh, yes, Bobby Crowder, his sister Ann, Bob Henley. All the Mickeys. The Mickeys lived in front.
Right, they lived in front.
And Mr. Mickey, Skinner, was the postmaster.
Okay.
And he, it was just a wonderful family. Of course, his son, Jack, ended up having the marina service station there for years. So it was...
I went to school with one of the Mickey boys. So I guess it may have been Jack's son, maybe, I don't remember, but
well, I really did enjoy, and our families were close too. Jack Mickey was near the age of my youngest uncle, David Stegall.
Right.
And I also wanted to tell you about I guess I could go back and tell you about my dad. Was really active as a young person. His hobbies, he was on the swim team. Would you believe Kingston had a swim team? I didn't know that until about 10 years ago.
Where did they swim?
Well, one of their classmates gave me a picture of my dad and the swim team. And so I actually don't know any of the details, but I was impressed. He played football. He played football, and he was an avid hunter, and he liked to later play cards and play bridge too.
Oh, is that right?
Poker and bridge. and as a young man, he would even his dad, I wanted to tell you, was his profession was maybe commodities. He was part owner of a peach orchard. He had a garage. He traded cars. I asked my grandmother, what did my grandfather do? And she said, well, he was a trader.
Yeah,
so
he did just a little bit of everything, didn't he?
He was also the mayor of Kingston in 1943.
Is that right?
And I guess one of my dad had 4 brothers, 6 sisters and 4 brothers, and 3 of the brothers all were in World War II. So that when I was young, that was a big focus.
Yeah.
We listened to the radio, and we read the newspapers.
Right.
And my Uncle Houston, my dad's next oldest, my dad was the oldest of the boys. My Uncle Houston was in World War II in a submarine, and performed an appendectomy.
Is that right?
And a book, The Silver Sides, was written about that experience while they were submerged and involved in war then.
Now, were y'all still living in Kingston during the war, or by then had you moved to Oak Ridge?
This is before I moved to Oak Ridge.
Okay, right.
I moved to the Oak Ridge when I was in the 5th grade. This was all happening.
While you were in Kingston?
And then his brother Bill was in the Navy on a ship. And then later, his youngest brother, David, was 10 years old. I mean, he was 10 years older than me. He flew one of the first missions in the Korean War. He was a pilot. Ended up being a major in the Air Force and retired.
So let me ask you a question. So you were growing up, you were in Kingston when they were building Oak Ridge, when Oak Ridge was working on the Manhattan Project. Did y'all know anything, or did you even know that anything was going on there?
No, they referred to it, I think, a firing range maybe, or
Kingston,
it was a government
the
project.
Kingston Demolition Range
And
is what they
we
call
were
it.
in war, and we thought that the people in Kingston thought they were participating by cooperating, and those at Wheat, they were cooperating toward the war effort.
Right.
Except those who were having their homes taken, it was a tough experience.
Sure.
And my cousin Annalee Gallagher tells about that. I have a little interview with her.
So the Gallaghers were your cousins.
My great grandmother was a Gallagher. Yes.
Okay, I interviewed Richard Gallagher. So Richard would probably be about close to maybe older than you, but this was several years ago. But he lived there. I mean, he was the Gallagher that lived where K-25 is.
Yes.
Yeah, right there.
And the Gallaghers and Browders, I have married. Browders and Gallaghers married brothers and sisters.
Right.
And we're double first cousin.
Oh, okay.
Or whatever, we're double.
Sure.
My grandmother was a Galler, married a Browder, and they had brothers and sisters to marry.
Sure, of course.
So we're very connected.
And that was not uncommon back then, because people had big families, and it was a small community,
Constricted.
Yeah.
I mean, you were less distance.
Sure,
The
exactly.
communities were. Yes.
All right, so let's get you into Oak Ridge. So when you moved to Oak Ridge, you said you lived in a flat top.
Yes, on 103 Ontario Lane.
Okay.
And we
Up off of Outer Drive, is that
yes,
correct?
near Georgia, not
Near
too
Georgia,
far.
not
We
too
could
far
walk to downtown.
Yeah.
We could walk through the woods to get to the grocery store and to the movie.
Sure.
We didn't do that often, but because we were pretty young. But
Yeah.
we never thought about any of that. We would
Sure.
walk with our mother
Sure. of
through the
course.
woods downtown.
Now, did they still have the wooden walkways?
No, when Oak Ridge began, when the people came with wooden sidewalks,
Yeah.
and that my dad, that's when the service stations, it was mud.
Yeah, it was mud.
I never did see it, but I heard them talking about it. And also, when before we moved to Oak Ridge, we would in 1943 began the wheat reunions at George Memorial Church.
Right.
Each first Sunday in October, the annual reunions, they're still held today.
Still having them.
And I've been a part of that my whole life.
Oh, have you?
Oh, yes. And we had to have passes they provided passes for us to come
To go
that
in.
Sunday. Yeah.
Let me ask you a question. How old were you when you moved to Oak Ridge?
I was in the 5th grade, 10 years old.
So you were 10.
About nine.
And what year was that?
1948 we moved.
Okay, so that was a year before they opened the gates.
Yes.
Did you have to? No, you were under 12, so you probably
I didn't
need-
have to have, but
you
my
didn't-
dad had a pass all
Had a
that
pass,
time.
right.
Yes. And my neighbors, when you're talking about Oak Ridge, we would go to church in the theater, the Ridge
At the
Theater.
Ridge.
They held the church services there. I
Right.
would go to the Methodist church, ride with neighbors. And my neighbor Colleen Black and Blackie were wonderful. I would babysit for David and Susan, and that my mother was just across the street, of course, and they would leave me after the children would go to bed, would leave me for an hour or two and to stay with the children, and I became very close and would continue to visit them when we returned to Kingston.
So how long were you in Oak Ridge?
Just about less than a year,
Oh,
because
okay.
my mother found out she was expecting Peggy B, my youngest sister, and because she had lost the baby
Yeah.
previously, she was concerned and wanted to come back to Kingston to the house we lived on Spring Street. We rented that house
Oh, okay.
to Doris and Jean Alford,
Okay.
who was then, I think, the football coach. And the Alford family there
Yeah.
has been in Roane County for years,
Sure.
and we remained friends in spite of them having to move within 9 months.
Right. So you were there for less than a year, and you came back. And why? Tell me again. Why did you all move to Oak Ridge?
Well, we moved to Oak Ridge so my dad would not have to drive from
Right.
Kingston to Oak Ridge. He was the manager of Vermont Gateway Service Station.
Oh, okay.
There were 3 shifts, and he had 3 shifts of a staff that would operate for 24 hours.
Wow.
And so they had several managers, but it would keep him from driving.
Sure. Exactly.
And then we returned home,
Right.
because of the traveling.
Did he do that
His whole life.
his whole life?
He retired. My dad, my dad developed lymphoma in 1967, and
Okay.
he died in 1968.
Okay.
And then he died at home. I would tell you that he cleared the property that we are living now on River Road.
Right.
He and Mother built a brick home on the property in 1962, and it was a great sacrifice and a great achievement to move
Sure.
down at that time to get that house completed and achieve that
Sure.
part. And he also surveyed this property that we're living on now to divide lots and sell in his retirement.
Now, was this where we are now? Is this part of that?
Yes, yes.
100 acres or whatever
Yes.
it was?
Yes.
Okay. All right.
Yes, TVA was acquired part of it to change the road on River Road.
Right.
But that was a life dream, I think,
Sure.
was to develop this property. And I guess I could tell you about my mother's family, or my mother
Yeah, please do.
was born in Wheat, and I guess I could say that she, at that time, when we were growing up, she was a great cook. She was instructed us to have good manners and to speak with good English, which was amazing that she didn't complete high school. She was married
Right.
before she completed high school, but she wanted us to be ladies and
Sure.
and be thoughtful and considerate of others.
Right.
And she.
And I guess with all girls, she kind of felt that
Right.
responsibility, didn't she?
She was an inspiration, right? After my dad died, the next year she married Edwin Arnold, who had lost his wife. Both spouses died with cancer.
Right.
And then that blended our family. Then she lived in Harriman and then moved to Kingston. And my mother died in 2010, and then
Oh,
Edwin
wow.
died a few months. Well, Edwin died first, and then Mother died a few months later.
What did he do? That name sounds
He
familiar.
was in insurance.
Insurance, Arnold?
Yes.
Yeah.
Yes.
I remember that.
He had 5 children when they married. The youngest was 4 years old.
Oh, wow.
The oldest in high school, and it was a nice blended family.
Sure.
We had many good times.
Sure, I'm sure.
I guess I could say Mother's family. I guess I've covered that. I don't know where to begin now. Again,
That's okay. That's all right. So that's kind of your history growing up, and something about your parents and what life was like for you then. Let's talk about you now. Let's talk about. You talked a little bit about growing up in Kingston. Let's talk about you and your family.
well, I finished high school, and my family.
Where you went to Roane County High School?
I wrote Roane County High School.
What year did you
played
grad-
basketball.
what year did you graduate?
Graduated in 1956.
Okay.
Enjoyed all the activities. Basketball was a big thing, and I.
Let me ask you a couple of questions about going to school. So I assume you went. Where did you go to elementary school? Is it where the elementary school is now?
Kingston.
Or I mean the old elementary school.
The old was a 2-story, 3-story building.
that was
torn down where the new elementary school
That
is
was
now.
the old junior high, wasn't it?
No, the old junior high, what came back toward Midtown, back this way, came west. It was a stucco, the stucco building,
It was up on the hill there above the high school.
where the tennis courts are now.
Right.
And the stucco became the junior high.
Right.
But the old elementary school was down below, down east of that.
Oh, okay.
And a wooden structure. I think it maybe there was they had dormitories years ago where the teachers and
Yeah.
people would stay, and then the school was right nearby.
Sure.
So we
So when
I enjoyed when we returned from Oak Ridge Elementary School, the junior high, just 2 grades.
yeah,
6th, 7th, and 8th grade was in the stucco building.
Right.
and Mrs. Hobgood was Mrs. Evelyn Ellis Hobgood was my teacher in the 7th and 8th grade. In the 8th grade, she became the first woman principal in Kingston.
Mrs. Hobgood was my principal when I was in middle school, when I was in junior high.
She was wonderful. She was quite a role model.
Yeah.
And dressed impeccably with a suit and high heels every day.
Oh, yeah.
And the whole Ellis family was inspiration. Good role models.
I have a good friend of mine. He tells a story about how he said he felt like he was kind of a Mrs. Hobgood's pet, and she was very stern and she could be very stern and very strict. And he says he remembers getting in trouble, being sent to down there, and he goes in her office and she says, "All right, what did you do?" And he tells her, and she kind of couldn't help but chuckle. And she says, "All right, now when you leave, I want you to look like I have chewed you out and that you are in big trouble." But yeah, she was there for a long time and had a great relationship with those students.
Talented.
Yeah.
She would play the piano for the Kingston United Methodist Church, the organ, and just a good role model.
Now, do you remember the name? Who the principal was at the high school? When you
yes,
went there?
Mr. Evans was the principal of the high school.
All right.
Had wonderful teachers.
Yeah.
too.
Tell me, were there any teachers that really kind of had an impact on you?
Well, Mrs. Bernard also was at the junior high.
Right.
I remember all my teachers in elementary school, and especially, in Oak Ridge. I loved Oak Ridge School, Cedar Hill School.
Right.
Miss Hedrick was my teacher, and she taught Spanish. We had a play that we presented. It was a whole nother experience, wonderful experience.
Sure.
And to come back to Kingston, I felt like I had a exposure to something different.
Sure.
But Mrs. Bernard was in the middle school, and she had a beautiful voice. She encouraged us to have a choir. We also in middle school had weekly, devotion. We had a meeting in the dorm, in the center of the school every day. I can't remember what they called it, but she would present. Ms. Bernard would encourage us to, in the arts, I guess, to sing and also crafts.
Sure.
She was a very talented person, and the summer of when I graduated, I met Ed Mason water skiing at Caney Creek.
Okay.
And he was actually had just come down. He had come down to with a friend to just see what was happening, and he invited us.
Try not to rock the.
Oh, okay.
That's okay. You can put it back towards you if you need.
We decided that we would meet at his house the next week.
Okay.
Meb Osmond was the person who had the boat, and we would water ski every weekend the summer I graduated from high school.
Sure.
And we built pyramids.
Okay.
At Caney Creek, and the families would gather and pull their boats in, and we decided that Mona Allen from Harriman and I would alternate being the top part of the pyramid.
Oh, is that right?
And wearing a ski belt.
Sure.
No life preserver or anything. And you would have a boat to follow to pick you up.
Yeah.
So we decided that that we would meet Ed Mason at his house in Oak Ridge the next weekend and go to the Oak Grove to dance. And anyway, we drove, Meb Osmond, Mona Ellen, and I. With my first date, I just met Ed through the car window, just for the first time, but we drove to the Mason's home
Right.
and met his parents. And then I rode with Ed to the Oak Grove. It was in Jefferson City, not Jefferson.
Jefferson Shopping Center.
Yes, I
Right.
think. And we began dating. Ed was getting ready to begin his senior year, his junior year at Tennessee Tech.
Oh, okay.
He graduated from Oak Ridge High School in 1949, and he worked for Southern Bell Telephone Company as a lineman for a year,
Right.
and then joined the Air Force and was at Keesler Air Force Base for 4 years as a class instructor.
Okay.
Decided to come back home, and that's when he entered Tennessee Tech. But that summer we met. He was going to enter his. He studied industrial management.
Okay.
And I began UT that year, and
So that would have
that
been,
was a new experience
that would
for
have been
me.
56, right?
1956, 58.
50.
And
So what did you study at UT?
I studied business administration.
Okay.
That was a bold choice, I guess,
Sure.
because I didn't even take typing in in high school.
Right.
So I began a challenge, to say the least.
Uh-huh.
But I was a member of the sorority, Delta, Delta, Delta,
Right.
and that very first year somehow was designated Sweetheart of Sigma Chi.
Oh, okay.
So that was a lot of activities with school.
Sure.
The biggest thing was that I would have a wonderful lunch. I would walk to the Sigma Chi house, get to know all the members, all the new members, old members, and I would send, my responsibility was to be there, get to know them, be a hostess for the
Sure.
parties with a house mother, Mrs. Reese, who, by the way, died that first year she died at the Sigma Chi house.
Oh, my
And that
goodness.
was a traumatic thing.
I'm sure.
And then they would have a wonderful home cooked meal, and they were like brothers to me.
Sure.
And they would walk me to the house, and to the Sigma Chi house, and in groups or just in conversation. And
Right.
then we would, I'd be a hostess at parties. But anyway, it was an exciting time. And during that time, I was able to visit my mother's sister, Mary Bird Browder Burnett, who had a boarding house, and she would have me over for broiled chicken dinners, and I could walk. She lived right behind the Lawson McGee Library on White Avenue.
Sure.
And they called her house the Bird House because.
Is that right?
Yes, and they've expanded UT. I guess in about 15 years ago. So many houses have been removed for parking lots,
Right.
but it hasn't removed my memories.
Sure, of course.
So I really was exposed to Knoxville and felt comfortable around the University of Tennessee because we'd visit my Aunt Bird there. And
Sure. And it was, and that was a time that, it was fairly safe. I mean, it was.
yes, it was. We walked everywhere, and
Yeah.
they were beginning to make you feel or be more alert
Right.
for safety.
Sure.
But I when I was at UT, lived in the new West Hall, and then the second year I was in Sophie Strong.
Okay.
And so there have many lifelong friends that I made from being there those 2 years.
Right.
I really am grateful for that experience.
So you were there for 2 years.
And then Ed Mason and I married.
Oh, because he graduated.
No, he was. We married in Kingston, December the 20th, 1958. and we went to Ed's graduation, 59, soon,
Okay.
just within 2 weeks,
Sure.
at the first of the year,
Yeah.
and moved to Nashville, where he had joined South Central Bell in the management program.
Oh, okay.
And we lived there for 9 months, came back. He was transferred to Knoxville, where our son Brantley Mason, Edward Brantley Mason Jr., was born. He was born in Harriman, but we lived on Stanton Road in Fountain City
Okay.
in Kingston. And Ed worked on Church Street in the office downtown Knoxville.
Right.
And then we were transferred to Maryville, where Suzanne was born, 1962, in Blount Memorial Hospital. We love Maryville, Tennessee. And at that time, we learned that Ed's mother, who is Florence Brantley Mason, and he had developed breast cancer, and Ed was transferred to Oak Ridge
Oh,
in 1963, I believe, and we decided to move in to care for her, and we lived with them for a year, and she died. Ed's mother died in June the 28th of 1964,
okay.
and that was a life-changing experience. I learned to give injections at the Oak Ridge Hospital using an orange the night
Right.
before she came home from the hospital.
Oh, okay.
And my sister Annabelle, by that time, was a nurse.
Oh, okay.
And well, she was in nurses training. Let's see, she was a nurse when we married, and she was in training at St. Mary's Hospital. But by the time Ed's mother died, she was married and was my mentor.
Sure.
And then we bought our house, our first home, on Culver Lane.
Okay.
And Ed's father was the banker in Oak Ridge. He was James Hoyt Mason. I guess I would like to tell a little bit about him.
Sure.
And he was from Augusta, Georgia, and Ed's mother, Florence Mason, was from Sandersville. And they were transferred. Well, his dad worked for a bank in Augusta, and then he resigned and was hired by the government as an auditor for banks. And then he was in Knoxville, and Mr. Preston with Hamilton Bank asked if he would come and be a manager of the bank as Oak Ridge was being developed.
Right.
And so they moved to Oak Ridge in 1943. And I remember Ed's mother, who had grown up in Sandersville, Georgia, and they were living in Augusta, because Ed's about coming to Oak Ridge in the mud and sidewalks.
Oh, sure. Sure.
And
sure.
that was a real challenge for them, for anyone coming. It was brave and exciting and challenging.
Oh, I'm sure. Yeah.
People were happy to have jobs,
Right.
but they sacrificed a lot too, I think.
Of course. Of course.
So where do I begin now?
All right. So
I went in Oak Ridge.
okay. Yeah. So you and your husband were in Oak Ridge. His mother passed away.
His brother Hoyt, Ed's brother Hoyt, is 18 months older, and they lived in Oak Ridge. They ended up living in the home where Ed grew up on Fonts Lane. When the Masons first came to Oak Ridge,
Where was that? What street?
Faunce,
Oh,
East
okay.
Faunce. It's off of Florida.
Yes, East Faunce.
When the Masons first came to Oak Ridge, they lived on Vermont Gateway, Vermont Avenue, in a D house because he was a banker. He got a D house.
Right.
But there was a spring, they determined later, when the two of the Mason children, Hoyt Jr., Ed, and his sister Barbara, was 6 years younger, developed polio.
Oh.
And they were hospitalized, and his brother Hoyt ended up with a limp, different, with the repercussions of polio.
Right, right.
But when Ed's mother developed cancer, they bought a house on 111 California Avenue, and Ed's brother had returned to Oak Ridge, married, and they moved into the 301 East Faunce Lane house off Florida Avenue. And that's where I went to see the family, the first date I had with Ed.
Oh, okay.
So his sister-in-law, Yvonne, is still living in that house now.
Is that right?
Yes. She's a couple of years, maybe 1 year older than I am. So Oak Ridge has a lot of wonderful memories. It holds many wonderful memories for us.
So how long were you in Oak Ridge at that
we,
point?
We bought our first house on Culver Lane, and the next year moved. Ed was by the way, in Oak Ridge, he was the manager of the telephone company. He was transferred to Chattanooga the next year.
Right.
While we were in Oak Ridge, I'll back up. Our son Brantley attended Woodland School in Oak Ridge, and our little Suzanne began kindergarten when we moved to Chattanooga.
Right.
We moved there where Ed worked downtown Chattanooga for the telephone company, and we moved 3 houses from my sister in Radmore. We're there with my sister Annabelle and Charles Hale and their children, and that was a wonderful time for her children, for Richard and Jenny.
Oh yeah, I'm sure.
For us to connect.
Sure.
And it was not just a few months later then that we were transferred to Nashville, where we lived on. Ed was in the downtown office. I love Nashville for that. We lived on Van Leer Drive out off Franklin. We lived when he was in training. We lived on Van Leer Drive before he was sent to Knoxville. But when we lived on Regent Drive off Ben Hogan Road, going 8th Avenue out past the Governor's toward Franklin and Brentwood. It was a wonderful place to live.
And what year was that, or about? Was that in the, what did you say, the mid-'60s, late 60s?
Yes, about 65, 64, 65.
And that was a time when Nashville was really still a really kind of a quaint town, wasn't it?
It was wonderful.
It was not the, the big old mess that it is now. It was a nice town.
We could go to the Children's Museum. Ed worked in the Green Hill Shopping Center there.
Sure.
And
I remember because just 10 years later, in 1975, when I graduated high school, I went to Belmont for 2 years.
Yes.
So it was still very similar. It was growing, but it was still a nice town to be in.
Well, in 1959, when we first moved, when Ed was in training, we lived in that West End area. We chose a garage apartment right there near Vanderbilt, West End.
Sure.
Went to church there, the Methodist church there for a while, and it was a wonderful place to live. You're right. And you talk about the progress. James Brierley Parkway was built, the exit was built just before we were transferred.
Yeah.
Before we were transferred back to Morristown.
Right.
Or forward to Morristown.
Right. So you were in Nashville. You weren't, but it appears that you all didn't stay very long at any of these
About
places.
no. When he was hired with South Central Bell, he was told to expect to move about every 2 years.
Oh wow.
They
just moved you. That's how they.
that
That's
was
how
to
you
give
move up.
that was to give him experience in the different locations and the different positions.
Right.
And he was in communications, and then in as a manager with the telephone company.
Right.
He was exposed to
All the different
everybody,
jobs,
all the problems, and Ed was a wonderful communicator, and he was a good manager.
Right.
Obviously.
So you were in Nashville for a couple of years, and then you
We're transferred to Morristown, Tennessee in 1968.
Okay.
And Brantley attended the little West End school. And Suzanne began kindergarten. And we bought a little brick rancher on Drennan Drive. And a couple of years later, decided to buy a home closer into town so they could go to Rose School. My mother had attended Rose School in Morristown when she lived with her sister, Mary Bird.
Right. I know. I mean, and it's the Rose Center now, I guess.
It is. So, yes, it is.
I've been in that building.
And Brantley and Suzanne, both attended Rose School, and we bought a little Cape Cod on the way closer into town and renovated that house, and loved living right downtown.
Sure.
Convenient to Crescent Center.
Oh, yeah.
And walking, well, we drove the children to school, and Ed was the manager of the telephone company, the district manager.
Right.
Well, for the offices, Rogersville, Segornsville, Bulls Gap, and Sneedville.
Right.
So we were able to, we were exposed to all those communities and the wonderful people,
Sure.
Ed especially.
Sure, exactly.
But there.
And how long were you in Morristown?
Well, we while there, I was a Red Cross volunteer, joined the Methodist Church. We were members of the Morristown First United Methodist Church, and Ed was in the Rotary Club and was involved in all the community activities.
Yeah, you became a real part of the community.
We were welcomed by the community as manager of the telephone company.
Right.
He has all the history there. Jim Burke, Senator Walters, all welcomed us. They were big telephone people.
Right.
Or they were interested in communications.
Sure.
And a good bit of progress was being made still with the telephone company.
Oh, yeah.
In the calling, expanding the calls and the way calls were made.
Sure.
And it was an interesting time. But then in 1974, Ed resigned from the telephone company to join Harriman Oil Company in Harriman. So we moved to Harriman, where my grandparents lived. And, of course, my mother's children, I don't know if I mentioned her, not her children, but her brothers, her siblings, were Mary Bird, Uncle Joe and William Browder, and Uncle Ray, Uncle George, Aunt Lou Maud, and Mother. Mother was the youngest of the 9 children, and
was George the one that had the hardware store?
Yes, he married Lucille Browder. It was J.S. Browder, and then became George Browder and Son.
We went to church with them. I mean, when I was growing up in Kingston.
Baptist Church.
And at First Baptist Church, and one of the Browder girls is close to my age. I think we may have even graduated
So there was
together.
John,
It was the youngest one.
Carolyn, Lillian, Sarah, and
Sarah.
Georgiana.
It was Sarah that I graduated
Yes.
with. So, yeah.
And so the
So anyway, y'all ended up, and he went to work for Harriman Oil.
yes, and we came back to rent the Spring Street house from my mother.
Oh, okay.
My mother had married Edwin,
Right.
and my sister Annabelle and her husband Charles Hale moved to the south of Kingston River Road house where my
Yeah.
parents built in 1962.
Sure.
So that house was available. Mother kept that
Kept it.
to rent, and Ed and I and Susanna Brantley lived at Spring Street
Okay.
for a few months until we could find housing in Harriman.
Right.
But Ed worked for Harriman Oil. In the summers, the couple of summers, we were sent to Ocala, Florida, where we
Right.
spent the summers on Lake Weir while Ed worked at the Harriman Oil that was in Ocala, Florida.
Right.
And we were there for just a couple, and then later, after we left Spring Street, we came to my grandmother's house. That was, we rented my grandmother's house on Devonia Street
Oh, okay.
while we were deciding to build a house in West Hills.
Right.
But we bought a house on McNew Drive, and so we lived in West Hills until we were transferred. That was a wonderful time to be in Harriman, be
Sure.
able to walk downtown where I lived. We could walk everywhere to the hospital.
Oh, yeah.
The children attended Harriman schools, Suzanne South Harriman Elementary, Brantley Harriman,
Right.
Freshman year in Harriman High School. And then Ed decided to join Publix Oil Company
Okay.
in Morristown.
Okay.
And there we moved to Bales Drive, and we were on a new journey
Back to Morristown.
back to Morristown, wonderful Morristown.
Now, how old were you all when that happened?
Well, in that was in the early 70s.
Early 70s.
It was around 74, 75, and Ed Mason was born in 1931. I was born in 1958, so in our
Okay.
30s. Ed's 7 years older than I am.
Right. So you were
But-
born in 38.
Yes, but
Okay.
at that time we were on a new journey, and Ed was involved again with Publix Oil Company, and cousins were there
Right.
with the Browder cousins, and we were there when Publix changed and moved away. There were big changes in that oil company in the 80s.
Right.
And Ed worked for Jefferson Savings and Loan for 5 years.
Oh, okay.
And I was involved by that time our children were in college.
Right.
And I began for the first time to have several job opportunities
Sure.
to expand my horizons
Sure.
other than a housewife
Sure.
and volunteer.
Yeah.
So they had just opened the Montgomery Ward store.
Oh,
so
yeah.
my neighbor's son-in-law was the manager, and they hired me
Wow.
as the paint lady. And
Okay.
then I worked at a friend's waterbed shop for 2 years,
Yeah.
because her husband was manufacturing waterbeds. He was a manager of his own company, but
It was the
they
70s.
sold
It was the
waterbeds
70s.
on
That's
the
when
side.
That's when
So
waterbeds were really big.
you never hear about them
I know,
anymore, do
not
you?
anymore.
But I was a manager of a waterbed shop
Wow.
out on Andrew Johnson Highway for
Yeah.
a couple of years.
Sure.
I formed with a friend, Tish Jones Bales, just a double third cousin. That's where the families come in, the Browders and the Birds.
Right.
A T and D monogramming. I did
Oh.
monogramming in the downstairs of our house.
Yeah.
And we did that for a couple of years. And then I worked for an orthodontist. And then I worked at Parkhurst Manor retirement home as activities director, actually filling in for a couple of years while that facility, which was a very large facility, maybe overextended. They were in transition.
Right.
And so was I.
Sure.
So were
exactly.
we. But I really enjoyed that time.
So how long did you stay in Morristown till?
From that, we moved about 15 years, I guess. In the late 1988, while Ed was at Jefferson Federal, I was doing these other little opportunities.
Sure.
I don't know exactly how many years. In 1988, my sisters and their husbands and Ed and I purchased some property joining my mother's property on River Road.
Okay.
And we decided to form RHS Properties and Dixie Builders.
Okay.
And we moved from Morristown in 1990. We
Okay.
sold our house on Bales Drive, moved to Kingston, and Ed and our family developed. Well, actually, our mother gave us 10 acres,
Okay.
and we developed River Chase subdivision.
Okay.
Novice developers.
Sure.
My brother-in-law Freddie Harvey was a real estate broker. In fact, Ed Mason even had a realtor's license.
Sure.
And
So you developed.
accomplished that development and built houses there.
Right.
At the time, Center Farm was being developed, and
Yeah.
Ladd Landing came
Right.
a little later.
Sure.
We were very bold and brave,
Right. Exactly.
never having done it. But we moved to the Bacon Farm. My youngest sister Peggy, married Steve Bacon, and his family are on Highway 58, the family farm, and we rented his grandparents, Oscar and Anna Bacon's former home. We lived there 5 years while we were developing. The county had just developed guidelines for the county.
Sure.
And so we had to build the roads, underground utilities, and begin building the houses.
Okay.
And we did that. And finally, in 1995, we completed the structure of our house there in Forest Trail, on 415 Forest Trail. And that's where we moved and lived until Ed died in 2010. He developed eosinophilic pneumonia or interstitial lung disease and died suddenly, after just a few weeks illness, July the 28th, 2010. And then that same year, my stepfather, Edwin Arnold, died in January or February. My mother died in April, and Ed Mason died in 2010.
Oh my
so
goodness.
that
was a tough year for you.
That was a challenging year.
So what did you do? What have you done since then?
I began
let's
volunteer
wrap
work.
it up.
What did I do? Back me up.
No, let's wrap things up. So what have you done since then?
I heard rap, yes. I began to do volunteer work. practiced Tai Chi
Uh-huh.
and decided that I was encouraged to move forward and lighten up. Sold my house on 415 Forest Trail with an opportunity to move to a beautiful 3-bedroom home right on the property that my dad purchased earlier. And in 2020, moved there. And I lived there with my companion, Jerry Helms.
Okay.
And I'm grateful to be living near my sisters, 2 sisters, my daughter, my niece, and feel the achievement and sacrifice that my parents made, my family made.
Right.
All family, all sides of the family.
Sure.
And I feel like that who we are and what we are is we're part of our ancestors and part of our life experiences. And I feel so grateful to have had the opportunity to have my life be affected by so many wonderful people that supported me and encouraged me. And
you've had the opportunity to leave home and go and have adventures and do things, but when it came right down to it, you came back and you're ingrained into the rich history of your family and of the land, and you seem to be pretty fine with that.
I'm grateful and just grateful.
All right. Well, I tell you what, we're going to stop and take a pause and see if there's anything else that you want to talk. But if not, thank you for taking time to share your story with not only with me, but with those that will watch it for, I'm sure, for generations to learn about your history and your story.
Thank you.